Hi everyone, my name's Emily Peacock and I've chosen to do my case study on the Jayant Patel or Dr. Death crisis that occurred in Queensland. So I've separated my case study into 6 separate topics. First, I'll give a quick background of the crisis and a timeline of the events that occurred. Next, I'll look at the crisis management framework and compare my case study to the 4 criteria: crisis preparedness and prevention, crisis incident management, post-crisis management, and finally ending with a conclusion. So for those of you who haven't heard of the crisis, I'll just supply a quick background. So this is a picture of Jayant Patel. He's an American-born surgeon who was hired in 2003 by the Bundaberg Hospital. When registering for work, he failed to disclose restrictions to his license and mentioned prior issues that he'd been reprimanded for during his time working in the United States. During his career, more than 20 complaints were filed against him to numerous health staff. However, Queensland Health failed to take any action and even promoted him to the Director of Surgery, despite him having no specialist surgical qualifications. A whistleblower from Bundaberg Hospital then approached members of Parliament who questioned Patel's employment, and that led to 2 inquiries being set up and Patel being charged with manslaughter, grievous bodily harm, and fraud in 2010. In 2012, a High Court appeal quashed all charges except for fraud, and in 2015 he was barred from ever practicing medicine in Australia again. Queensland Health were found to have failed to complete an adequate reference and identity check, and they were forced to pay over $9 million in damages to the whistleblower Tony Hoffman, other staff, and patients of Patel. According to Hamish McLean, crises can fall under 4 different categories: sudden crises, such as natural disasters; reputational crises, such as those that impact stakeholder trust; bizarre crises that happen as a result of unusual circumstances; and emerging crises, which are those that can develop into crises over time. This particular crisis falls under the emerging crisis framework and is a crisis that occurred as a result of Queensland Health failing to monitor its environment, failing to prioritise or address complaints, and ignoring complaints in the hope that the problem would just go away. Coombs also classes this as an intentional crisis and states it provides the biggest reputational threat. Because the crisis was so complicated, I decided to provide a timeline of events outlining the key moments of the crisis where Queensland Health could have acted. I've colour-coded this first part of the timeline to show where the events stand in relation to Register and Larkin's 2008 issues timeline. So blue refers to the origin of the issue, where Queensland Health could have first taken action. So under that category, we have when Jayant Patel started working at Bundaberg Hospital and the registration processes that were found to be inadequate, and also when nurse Tony Hoffman first started raising concerns. This would have been an ideal time for Queensland Health to implement preparation and prevention strategies in order to overall prevent the crisis. The point I've highlighted in green refers to the 20 complaints received by Queensland Health over a 20-year period, and that falls under the mediation and amplification stage. And the third colour-coded purple is the crisis in action. So it refers to the issue gaining intensity and maturing. So for that, I've referred to 2005 when Hoffman blew the whistle in the crisis, when Patel resigned, and when the media broke the story of Patel's US history. The last points and those on the following page, colour-coded grey, refer to the resolution part of the issue's life cycle. Here we have Premier Beattie's announcement to form an inquiry, and that same inquiry being axed due to bias. And now looking at the events that took place following the second inquiry. So Patel was officially charged, extradited at the cost of the state. He was found guilty and sentenced to 7 years in prison. But then in a retrial was acquitted of all charges except for those relating to fraud. Finally, in 2015, he was barred from ever practicing medicine in Australia again. So now that we've looked at the background and the timeline of the crisis, I'll move on to analysing it using JAC's 2007 Crisis Management Framework of Crisis Preparedness and Prevention, Crisis Incident Management, and Post-Crisis Management. This framework is similar to McLean's PPRR framework, which refers to preparedness, prevention, response, and recovery. So, crisis preparation and prevention. According to Coombs, there are 6 ways in which companies should prepare for a crisis. The first and most important is diagnosing vulnerabilities. Assessing crisis types, just as I did when I identified that this type of a crisis is an emerging one. Selecting and training crisis management team and spokespersons. Developing a crisis management plan, or CMP, and reviewing the communication systems that the company will use in the event of the crisis are all great strategies. According to JAX, crisis preparedness and crisis prevention are 2 essential components of effective crisis management, and they happen prior to crises occurring. There's a number of precautions Queensland Health could have taken during the pre-employment assessment phase in order to prevent the crisis from occurring. So specific prevention strategies could have included verification of identity and more extensive resume checks, working and criminal history checks, imposing a more efficient pre-employment assessment, introducing supervised practice, and planning and making reporting mandatory. Some preparation they could have taken includes the selection of crisis management team and the creation of a crisis management plan. They could have prepared media materials such as Queensland Health fact sheets, press release templates, key messages, etc. They could have had a contact list and plans to contact stakeholders in the event of a crisis. And finally, because it was found that Bundaberg Hospital were following outdated regulatory guidelines, they could have ensured that they were up to date with that. Next, we'll move on to actual crisis incident management and looking more at the internal complaints process. So the main issue here was the failure to acknowledge and the acts of complaints by and act on the complaints by health staff and patients. If Queensland Health had acted sooner, then there's a good chance that the issue could have been resolved and it wouldn't have moved on to the next issue life cycle phase. I just thought I'd include this quick extract from the Nurses Union inquiry on the matter, which found that the whistleblower went to more than 10 different people in order to get her issue heard, and I thought that was absolutely crazy to think that there was still nothing done despite all that. So when the complaints finally were heard from a Member of Parliament, Queensland Health really should have gone into their crisis incident management phase. JAC cites crisis recognition, system activation and response, and implementation of a crisis management plan as the key steps in this phase. But unfortunately, Queensland Health failed to do any of this. Following the statements made in Parliament, the Acting Director of Nursing called a meeting about ICU staff. District Manager Mr. Leck attended and expressed anger about the nurses' breach of confidentiality. He referred to the industrial document and mentioned that staff breaching their confidentiality could be imprisoned for 2 years and lose their jobs. He was appalled that a senior surgeon could be treated in such a way, and so he really failed to recognise the crisis, enact a response, or take appropriate measures. Following the whistleblowing, Queensland Health seemed to make the situation even worse by, according to Hoffman, treating her like a leper. She was threatened with performance management, called untrustworthy, and ostracised because she blew the whistle on this internal crisis, even despite being placed on the Australian of the Year honour roll in 2006. This eventually led to a completely new crisis, accusations of bullying within the health system, and compensation for Hoffman. It's unknown the exact amount of compensation she received, but she did request $400,000 and reached a private agreement with Queensland Health. The situation was made even worse because Hoffman later received Rural Australian of the Year medal, which increased her reputation and posed an issue for the hospital's image restoration strategies it was using at the time, which I'll look at a bit later. So the theory on post-crisis management suggests that Queensland Health should have acted quicker to verify the crisis information, released a statement which outlined a rough timeline of the next statement. It should have given clear key messages and cooperated as well as apologised, told the truth and provided reassurances to its stakeholders. Instead, Queensland Health didn't release a statement or address the issue until it had already reached the 3rd stage of the issue's life cycle. It did hold an internal meeting with Tony Hoffman, but as we saw, it didn't contain any rebuilding strategies and only really made the situation worse. It didn't use social media or press releases to communicate with stakeholders and had a really delayed response. It used scapegoating strategies such as firing Queensland health workers and paying for Patel to leave the country, resisted the Davies Commission and didn't give an apology until some years later when Patel was convicted. Coleman's 2004 study found that corporate crises in Australia typically cost more than $10 million and that 25% of the organisations who experience a corporate crisis do not survive. In the case of Queensland Health, taxpayers were fronted with a nearly $10 million bill. As you can see from this breakdown of costs, it wasn't just compensation that Queensland Health were required to pay as a result of this crisis. Legal costs and other expenses were also required. I couldn't find the total cost for the inquiries, but the first was in excess of $6 million, so the final amount would have been substantially more and added to these costs. According to Coombs' 2005 Situation Crisis Communication Theory, or SCCT, there are three main clusters of primary response strategies. Blue refers to denial strategies, which include Queensland Health removing senior health ministers and paying Patel to leave the country, which were both really seen as scapegoating by the organisation. Using diminishment responses is the second category, highlighted in green, which attempted to urge the public that Patel was being treated unfairly and that the Commission was making it out to be much worse than what it was. And the third set of response strategies were rebuilding ones, which unfortunately came a bit too late for Queensland Health, but included enacting an independent commission, ensuring that there were tougher checks for overseas doctors, giving financial compensation, apologising, and it was also the beginning of the implementation of the NRAS scheme, where there would be national consistent legislation in the hopes of preventing a crisis like this from happening again. So during this whole crisis, Queensland Health's reputation was in absolute chaos. It was made worse when so much praise was given to the whistleblower, Tony Hoffman, and the hospital decided to basically oppose her. It meant they weren't able to efficiently use image restoration strategies. They couldn't use evasion of responsibility tactics, such as claiming it was an accident, and that they had no idea any of this would happen. They couldn't reduce the offensiveness by attacking the accuser because it was already proven she was doing the right thing. And so they were really only left with corrective action and mortification. Corrective action strategies were imposed on them by the Premier, and an apology only came after Patel was charged. So all in all, Queensland Health's image restoration didn't go smoothly at all. Conclusion. So the crisis was due to a number of factors. The Morris Commission specifically highlighted these six: an inadequate state budget, defective administration, no method of assessment, failure to investigate the complaints, lack of monitoring, and a culture of concealment. To conclude, this crisis is a perfect example of how crises can expand if they're not dealt with. At the start, Queensland Health only had to deal with Jayant Patel, but after failing to address the issue, they were left with two more problems: whistleblowing and the revelations about bullying and inadequacy in the system, which they also had to address. Thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoyed this presentation.